Yes, Alan, I was born in a small farm town called Fowler, California. 2,000 people, salad bowl of cultures. You name the ethnicity, we had it. Um, Imagine a little farm town of 2,000 people with 13 different churches. My graduating high school class was 90. So I felt very, I always feel very blessed. Any of us, we're Red Cats, we call ourselves. That's our mascot of our high school team. And to be able to grow up in an environment where your friends are Armenians, Latinos, blacks, Asian, white, Indian. So I really feel that we all that grew up in this town, and in the Central Valley where I grew up, no other town was like ours. To be able to have access to the amazing foods, the ethnic foods that the other cultures and heritage would share with us, the art, the music. So growing up in this small farm town was pretty amazing. My grandpa came from the Ola, which is the Big Island of Hawaii, in 1886. So he was one of the first wave of Japanese Americans that came from Hiroshima, Japan, then worked the sugarcane plantations in Ola or near Hilo, Hawaii. And his goal was to have a farm. So his boss, who was very generous, taught him how to read and speak English. So he came over in 1886, and there was so many discriminatory laws back then, anti-immigration for Issei, alien land laws. They couldn't buy land. He went from Hiroshima, Japan, to the Big Island, and much like all the other Americans, had to work the sugarcane, plantations, and the Puna sugarcane plantations where, he worked. He put the wood into the boiler room to melt down the sugar. And so when he came over, because of these discriminatory laws, he had an edge. He could speak English, he could read. So when they found out he couldn't purchase the land, he put it under my dad, Toshio Nakagawa, and Johnny, his firstborn. And so that way he was able to get the 40 acres of grapes. What we're real proud of in our family legacy is he helped many other families from Hawaii do the same thing. They would come over, he would basically get the land for them, deed it under my dad and my uncle's name, and then whenever they could, pay him for the deed, he would just deed it back over to them. So I grew up I tell people I'm the pool hall kid. My mom and dad had a pool hall in the small town of Fowler, and so I pick grapes, I pick tree fruit. And what education it was growing up in this little town. My dad was considered, when I talk about sports in general, I have to backtrack to my dad's father. Hisataro Nakagawa was a great athlete. He played baseball for the Puna Plantation baseball team, because in Hawaii, a lot of the different plantation teams would play each other. It was pretty much like slave labor, 7 days a week, but Sundays they allowed a few hours for the key plantation teams to play each other, which my grandfather was part of. And then later, my dad in 1924 would throw a 9-inning no-hitter for the Carruthers Blue Raider high school team against Layton. My Uncle Johnny would be considered the Nisei Babe Ruth. When he was in his 20s, he made early tours with the Fresno Athletic Club to Japan as early as 1924 or 1927. He got to play against the All-Stars of the Negro Leagues and the Latin Leagues. They had to kind of play in leagues of their own. Pre-war, there was a Jim Crow baseball law that basically, unless you were white, you weren't going to play Major League Baseball. So Latinos, blacks, Asians had to play within leagues of their own. My uncle was a great, much like today's Shohei Ohtani with the Anaheim Angels, he's a home run hitting pitcher. My uncle was a left-handed pitcher, and he was a power hitter. He hit 377 against the All-Stars of the Negro League. One author, Bill Staples, made a point by saying that Johnny Nakagawa couldn't play in the major leagues, but since he hit 377 against the All-Stars of the Negro Leagues, he certainly could have been a Negro League ball player. To me, I wish he would have gotten an opportunity. He certainly had the skills, he had the tools to play Major League Baseball. He certainly impressed many of the African American or the black All-Stars. We had so many great, pre-war ball players. I'm just very proud that baseball has been in our family for 4 generations.
So how big was this guy for a Japanese guy? He must have been pretty big.
My uncle was 5'10", about 165 pounds, so he was pretty big for a Nisei. He was also a football player. My dad was a semi-pro football player as well when they didn't even have the face bars. I mean, just leather hats, basically.
Yeah, left-handed pitcher, power hitter, Babe Ruth. Was there any of those kinds of comparisons?
Not really. During those days, I mean, you had, other than the major leaguers, that was one situation, but we had so many, as I always say, a lot of people like to talk about Ichiro, Shohei Ohtani today, but we had so many Issei, Nisei ball players that had the heart, had the passion, could have played Major League Baseball, much like the Negro League All-Stars and the Latin All-Stars, but thank goodness that it ran from as far south as the Tijuana Nippons to the Vancouver Asahi, as far east as the Nebraska Nisei, and as far west as the Hawaiian Islands, which were a whole league of their own. My grandfather was a farmer, and towards August of 41, all Japanese Americans' assets were frozen, yet the bombing of Pearl Harbor didn't happen until December. So they pretty much, my grandmother had a restaurant on my mother's side, and my grandfather across the street on my maternal side, grandparents had a general store. So World War II, bombing of Pearl Harbor happens. They round up all the Nikkei 5,000 in the Central Valley, where I'm from, and put them in the Fresno Fairgrounds, most in the animal stalls, where the horses and the sheep and what other livestock they had were there. And my grandmother, I remember my mom telling me that as they got on the train that had blinders on both sides of the window, she could peek out the bottom, and they were getting ready for a 4.5-day train ride to Jerome, Arkansas. They had already been put into the Fresno Fairgrounds in August, and then they left in December. So they put them in the extreme heat of the valley, which is, upper hundreds. And they tried to wash the manure from the livestock out of the areas. But as we know, if you fire hose it with water, that smell's going to come back. But I never forget my mom telling me that on their journey to Arkansas, before they left Fresno, they saw signs from the racists and bigots of the time saying, "Get out of Fresno, never come back to California." And it hurt my mom, and so she asked her mother, which was my grandma who had the restaurant, what's going to happen to us? Is this going to be like, the Jewish culture in Germany, and we're going to have to go into these camps? And she goes, "Oh, no, this is the greatest country in the world. All immigrants have to pay a price. We'll prove how loyal we are and come back." So unfortunately, 6 months later, my grandmother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And so they couldn't do anything with the hospitals that they had set up in the camps. And so she passed away in the camp. And they even put, we have a photo with her coffin with flowers all over the top. I said, where did all these flowers come from? But they were handmade out of toilet paper. How, ingenious they were to respect, the elders that went before them. So they sent in our culture we cremate, so they sent my grandmother's body to Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And about 3 months later, a Folgers coffee can comes to my mother's barrack, and she remembered it was block 41-40-A was their apartment barrack. All the barracks were 20 by 100 divided by a rope into quadrants. So if you had a big family, you lived in one quadrant, a young couple would be in another. And so she opened up the Folgers coffee can, and on top of my bachan's ashes was a piece of paper. So she thought it was her name, and she opened it up, and all it indicated was she was a Jap woman. And so the inhumanities really didn't stop with her death, which hurt my mom because all she could think about by seeing this label was this amazing speech that my grandmother had given her, on the journey to Arkansas. But, my grandma's spirit, my grandfather's spirit, that's the tragedy. The inspiration for our family is once they returned, they 3.5 years later, they went from Jerome, Arkansas. My Uncle Johnny got a job in Chicago with International Harvester, the farm equipment manufacturers. And then he sent for my dad, and my sister was only about 2 at the time. So my mom and my dad and my sister joined my uncle, his wife, my Auntie Alice, and their daughter, Libby, in Chicago. Then they came back when they felt it was safe, so to speak, because kind of for me, the hidden legacy about the Japanese American incarceration is that not only did they have to spend, 4 years in desert wastelands, get denied their civil liberties, their constitutional rights, their everything that was basically American to them. And at the same time, they let them play baseball, which is ironic. And they took everything away from that was American. Even the Issei couldn't speak their foreign language or their native tongue. A lot of the faiths couldn't practice in the beginning, whether you're Buddhist, Christian, what have you. So when they got back from Chicago, one of the things that, again, this hidden legacy that people don't remember is that during the internment, that's one thing. The post-war legacy, I think they had to come back to almost 10 years of hatred and hostility because they were labeled alien, enemy aliens. They really sacrificed a lot when they came back. And I remember my mom telling me when they got back to the Sacramento train station, a woman came up to her and said, "How dare you come back to California?" And so the McClurgs and the Ravens were our neighbors on the 40-acre grapes that we had. And they had caravanned all the way to Sacramento, about a 6-hour drive, to pick up my family and pile them into cars. But what was terrible was the Ravens and McClurgs had even been egged and spit on from the racists that were there, knowing they were there to pick up our family. And so they caravanned them back to the ranch, and Grandpa Raven, Jep Raven, gave my grandfather a cigar box. And as he opened it, thinking it was cigars to celebrate their return, it was full of cash. So not only did Jep Raven and Mr. McClurg watch our family farm for 3.5 years, they gave them back the profits it made. That's really 1% of the indicators of what really happened. 98% of Japanese Americans lost everything: their homes, their businesses, their college education. So that's the Nakagawa tragedy and inspiration. No, my dad, Alan, was already too old. He was born in 1905. My Uncle Johnny in 1900. So they were already in their 40s. And so they were, basically spectators then. But Moss, Jerome had a lot of history just within its camp. I think I mentioned to you earlier that great ball players from Florin. There were the Tsukamoto brothers, Moon Karima. They were the all-stars of the Jerome All-Star team. And they actually brought in an outside team, the Arkansas A&M college team from Arkansas, and Moon shut them out 6-0. And it was a huge victory for the Arkansas, Jerome internees, because at any time, anytime you have to play outside teams, you would think that they would be stacked to their advantage. But Moon threw a 21 strikeout semi-pro game before he even left camp. And so I always say that if it wasn't for World War II, we probably would have had a Nisei ball player playing in Major League Baseball before even Jackie Robinson. But because of World War II, players got injured. Some still tried out. I always think of Harry Honda, who was an all-star left-handed pitcher for the San Jose Asahi. This is a team that beat the Tokyo Giants in the early 30s, who basically were almost unbeatable. And little Russell Hinaga, barely 5 foot tall like Kenichi Zenimura, was the pitcher. Through 9 innings, it was a 1-0 game, and San Jose team comes up, and Victor Starfin, who was the pitcher for the Tokyo Giants, throws a pitch, and he threw mid-90s. And Russell hit it up the middle, and with bases loaded, they won the game on a walk-off single. That was huge because you have so many great players that in the camp days, like Hinaga and like so many other ball players. Henry was the left-handed pitcher, and he probably was one of the top left aces that the Asahi had. And prior to the war, the Brooklyn Dodgers gave him a tryout. So they were kind of waiting to see how he'd get through this camp experience. And they gave him another chance, and he had thrown his arm out by then. But prior to that, the Cleveland Indians, for Henry, signed him to a contract on December 1st, 1941. And on December 7th, they tore up his contract. But I remember taking Henry and 15 Nisei pioneers, our Nisei Baseball Research Project. We organized and had our exhibit go to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1996. And Henry was part of our group. We had another guy, Tar Shirachi, from the Salinas area. He was a pitcher also. He went with us. He was the oldest, I think, at 95. But Henry, all the media, we had a lot of TV crews wanted to interview Henry because of that Cleveland Indians story, right? Mr. Honda, we hear that, Cleveland Indians signed you, and a few days later they tore up the contract because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And Henry got sick on the plane. I remember he had to struggle. He, I didn't even know if he was going to make it through the whole trip. And even at the museum, we needed to get him a wheelchair. And so the staff was busy trying to get him, because he told me, Kerry, he goes, I can't walk. This museum is huge. I said, oh, sure, Henry. And just as we brought the wheelchair up to him, all the news people wanted to talk to him. And he goes, hey, I don't need that chair. And we did a lot of, done many, many, many events with different major league teams to honor our Nisei pioneers. And it's incredible to see these 90-year-old guys turn into like little leaguers when they get on that baseball field. And Henry, I'll never forget, told the TV crew that, I was a pretty good ball player and pitcher. I loved it pre-war. I loved it during the war, even though I didn't get a chance to show, my stuff with Cleveland. And he goes, so today coming to the Baseball Hall of Fame and being honored is the greatest day of my life. And so I reminded him, I said, well, Henry, what about your kids and your grandkids? And he goes, Kerry, today's the greatest day of my life. And so, yeah, I just remember how special, that moment was. My uncle, my grandpa, so I was an all-star shortstop when I was playing all the way on up into high school and junior college. And football, my dad was a semi-pro football player, so football was huge for me too. My son is an all-star catcher. Now we have 2 grandkids. Ozzy's 5 and Will the Thrill is going to be 2. So maybe it'll be 5 generations that'll have baseball in our family. But yeah, I feel that I'm very blessed to have this 4 generations, 5 generations of baseball in our family, and also to have uncles that competed, in Japan, Korea, Manchukuo, China, pre-war, 1924, 27, 37. And so that's basically, Alan, why I started. Originally, we wanted to do get funding to do a documentary, and I couldn't get any funding for it. So we started a small exhibit that first started at the Fresno Art Museum, then it blossomed to San Francisco, and then eventually it went to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown and in Tokyo. From the exhibit, we wanted to make it more multimedia, so we did this documentary, and I recruited my godpapa, Noriyuki Pat Morita, to be my on-camera host, narrator, writer. So then that was the second phase. The third was our book. This is the second edition. The first edition was hard copy. And then it went to our film, American Pastime. We won the audience favorite back in 2007. And I think our film is more relevant today than 12 years ago. And it's basically baseball in the camp, a love story, and jazz music told inside the Topaz, Utah concentration camp during World War II.
So what festival did that play?
The San Francisco, the Asian American International Film Festival back in 2007. So and we have many other events and activities. We're excited to be here at the National Ballpark Museum, and today having another panel presentation. There's a website called AmericanInnings.org that have captured 5 different vignettes on baseball in the camps, primarily ball players that played during World War II and were also in the military, and then also how baseball started in Japan initially, and just kind of like wildfire grew throughout Japan, and that's why I feel they consider it their pastime as much as we do ours. And then from the curriculum, this is where, from the film, we developed 2 curriculum. And so we offer it to teachers, students that teach about the history of the incarceration, but through the prism of baseball. And so we're able to, we have tons of activities and interpersonal different activities that we do. And it's been pretty amazing how, especially with the new students, they never read about it in history books. And so through our curriculum, we're at least able to adapt it, and hopefully teachers will, however much time they can spend on that subject matter, will use it. Here in Denver, I like to talk about Nance Ito, who was one of the greatest softball catchers from this area. And she she's actually in the National Softball Hall of Fame, I think in 1982, but she played for multiple teams, was a great ball player, catcher from Denver. The Yagi brothers, post-war in Ordway, they had like this Nisei championship game, and there was 5 brothers on the starting squad out of 9. So, Moss, of course, Yoshimura, that we're going to see this afternoon. Looking forward to hearing some of his stories too. But yeah, it was vast, Alan. It ran. And the thing is, they had 3 divisions. Even in the camp days, the Gila River Eagles had 32 teams and 3 divisions in a baseball camp. In the camp itself. They had, pre-war, it was A, B, and C leagues. A was semi-pro level, B was high school level, C was junior high level. Now the kicker was, it didn't matter how old you were. You could be 25 and be on a C team. You could be 15 and be on an A team. The irony of, if you had a person or a family relative that died outside the camp during World War II, you couldn't visit them or pay your respects. But baseball gave these ball players in the camps amnesty to go from Gila River, Arizona, all the way to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, or Amache, Colorado, which to me was amazing. For them to be able to get on a train, transfer onto buses, even though they were considered enemy aliens. But that's that dynamic I feel that baseball still has today. You know, you have the Cubans, the Dominicans, others are just trying to get over here and play professional baseball. And maybe some on the boat have professional experience, maybe some don't. The ones that don't have to go back to their country. The ones that are great ball players, sometimes they get into the United States and get into Major League Baseball. So even to this day, we see this kind of amnesty of the game. We had tremendous Issei and Nisei ball players pre-war. That could have been future Ichiros, future Otanis that we would have seen at a major league level. Unfortunately, they didn't get to play. So we'd like them to be recognized, you know, to have, there's 17 African-American black all-stars in the Baseball Hall of Fame. We have, because of the internet, access to new box scores that we never had access to pre-war. And out of the 12 box scores pre-war between black all-stars and Nisei all-stars, the Nisei won 8 out of the 12 games. The second phase is American ambassadors. As early as Frank Fukuda and the Seattle Asahi team in 1914, 1918, 1921, he led tours from Seattle, the Cherry and Asahi team, to Japan. And they did barnstorming exhibition games with the universities, merchant teams. We would love to see the Fresno Athletic Club, the Seattle Asahi, the LA Nippons, the Stockton Yamatos, the San Jose Asahi, the Alameda Kono ATK, they would call them, pre-war team out of Alameda, Oakland, be recognized, as well as the Philadelphia Royal Giants, the Chicago Black Sox, they would call themselves. They were all black teams, would go to Japan on tours, goodwill tours. In 1924, they went in 27. But yet, Major League Baseball always wants to recognize Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Charlie Gehringer, the 1934 basically Hall of Fame team played the Japan All-Stars. So most expert analysts want to say that if it wasn't for this 34 team, baseball in Japan wouldn't have started professionally in 1936. Well, we like to disagree with that. We think the Japanese Americans and the African American blacks should get way more credit for having them turn professionally in Japan in 36, because they went on their own, you know, as early as 1914. Not just Japan, but Korea and Manchukuo, China. So if we see all these teams today, just about every major league roster has an Asian player on it, from Japan, from Taiwan, from Korea, from China. Our American ambassadors should get more credit for it. And then thirdly, even though they've been marginalized, I always say that Japanese Americans have been sitting at the back of the history bus for too long. This aspect to me is really disturbing, that the ball players, Nisei ball players, have been marginalized so much that anytime when we bring up that they kept the All-American pastime alive, even from behind barbed wire during World War II, it gets shoved under the rug, or that was a dark time in our American history, we shouldn't bring that up. But the way I look at it is that, they kept baseball alive even from behind the barbed wire of a concentration camp in America. No other race could make that statement. So that's why I feel that these ball players that had their careers cut short during World War II are still being marginalized for playing the game they loved. Dave Davis wrote an article for Sports Illustrated. The title was A Place in the Desert That Felt Like Home, and that was the baseball field. And I think that's how everybody kind of, in the most abnormal times as possible, they made as much normalcy as possible. They made road trips, playing other states. They were the symbols and the just the inspiration for the communities in the camps. When the Tucson Badgers, who hadn't been beaten in 3 years, had a 52-game winning streak, had a pitcher, Lowell Bailey, with a 0.00 ERA, come into the Gila River camp to play Kenichi Zenimura's two sons and their all-star team. It's 10-10 in the 10th inning, bases loaded, the Eagles are up, 8,000 internees are at the game. And this is on a Pima Indian reservation, mind you. Kenichi Zenimura takes 3 straight balls, 2 straight strikes, and on the 6th pitch, took the bat off his shoulder and ripped it past the third baseman. So the Gila River Eagles upset the Tucson Badgers 11-10 in 10 innings. It's almost like a Hollywood, script, right? And I remember talking with Hanley Slagle, the coach of the Badgers, and he was a former SEALs professional player for Lefty O'Doul. And I asked him, I said, Hanley, what was it like for your kids to go into this camp with barbed wire, guard towers, and they're playing baseball? And he goes, oh, Kerry, he goes, my boys just knew that they were going to face another great baseball team. We didn't want to, disappoint our community. And, but yeah, they put it on us. We made a bunch of errors. Lowell got hit for 11 runs. There goes his ERA, right? But he goes afterwards, I'll never forget the generosity of the community. They brought us cold melons and fruit after the game, and the ball players drew big circles in the sand and taught my boys how to sumo wrestle, a Japanese sport, And he goes, just the fellowship alone. And he goes, unfortunately, we tried to play the home and home game in Tucson, because that's what Coach Zenny and Coach Slagle had arranged. We'll play one game in your home field and then one game in Tucson, our home field. Well, they wrote letters back and forth to each other that we have, and basically Zenny said that, I'm sorry we weren't able to have the return game, and Slagle says, yeah, these so-called 100% Americans here in Tucson aren't going to allow it. But he goes, and then Zenny responded by saying, well, once this war ends, we can all be part of one team, Uncle Sam's. But I'll never forget the beautiful letters between the two of them. So in 2006, we had 6 remaining Badgers and 6 Eagles. And we reunited them again for a luncheon on a Saturday to kind of talk story, and they all were right back in those moments again. Because the next day, Sunday, the Tucson Hall of Fame Museum was inducting both teams, the Tucson Badgers and the Gila River Eagles, as the model of American sportsmanship. So it was beautiful to see almost 60 years later, the circle closed. The same community that wouldn't even allow this game was now inducting these same ball players as the model of American sportsmanship. I thought that was pretty cool. What else can I mentioned AmericanInnings.org, right? On Facebook, we have the Nisei Baseball Research Project. If you want to kind of see what we are currently involved with, that's the most up-to-date. And then we also have a website, www.niseibaseball.com.